We're diving in chapter 5, a word called genetics, or the study of inheritance. The study of, you see it right in the word, genes. What genes are, what we've learned they do, and how they work together. It's straightforward, but it gets more complicated the more you learn about it. It isn't just a simple pattern, and it always follows the same pattern. God has designed an infinitely interesting web of inheritance that we are always learning more about. This chapter, we're thinking about how this genetic information can be used, both how it works and how it's helpful for us as we track things like disorders and understanding kind of the way we work and the way we operate from the inside out, and why we look the way we do. Still thinking about those things. Just today, our lesson 1, called In Human Inheritance, we're aiming to answer the patterns of human inheritance and the functions of the specific chromosome, the 23rd pair we call the sex chromosome. Here is a nice review diagram I really like that sort of breaks this all down, probably better than any way I've shown so far, where we have the chromosomes in the nucleus of the cell. Chromosomes have thread-like structures that make them up called DNA. If you were to unwind and look at those on a microscopic level, you've got the sugar framework, the sides of the ladder, if you will, and then the nitrogenous base rungs. And we've learned there's 4 kinds that link together. A always with T and G always with C. If you take a series of those, maybe it's 8 bases in a row, maybe it's longer, we call that section a gene. All right? Different forms of genes we call different alleles. Let's review some important terms that will come in handy today for the lesson that you should have already read before you view this presentation. That's the best way to learn this. First of all, phenotype versus genotype. What's the difference? Genotype is literally the way the alleles are arranged inside of you. It's the gene information. Phenotype then is the human trait we see, determined by the genotype. So if it helps, you could say genotype comes first and determines the phenotype we see in real life. Recessive is a form of allele that will be masked by a dominant form of an allele. You would need 2 of them to witness the phenotype in the person and the trait. Back in pages 87 and 88, a couple chapters ago, I think I was gone for this, you learned 5 different patterns of inheritance. If I were to organize this book, I would have maybe made that lesson right before this one, because we're about to dive into all these terms again. And now it's been several weeks. You've maybe grown hazy on these. We want these in the front of our minds. It's really what we're talking about today. And if you look back at page 87 and 88, you'll find these 4 patterns. First, incomplete dominance, meaning one allele is only partially dominant along with another allele which is only partially dominant. It's not completely masking the other. In fact, you have 2 dominant alleles that look different and as a result blend together. For example, the dominant red and dominant white allele combined in a snapdragon flower results in a pink snapdragon flower. Co-dominance, both alleles for a gene are cooperating and expressed equally. They aren't blended, they're both there. Okay? Black chicken and a white chicken have a baby. That chicken will have both fully black and fully white feathers. We will see both fully at the same time. Multiple alleles means that instead of just 2 alleles determining a trait, there are many alleles, even though you'll only ever have 2 at a time, as we've learned with a Punnett square. There are many alleles that could determine it, and that's why there aren't just 2 hair colors, right? There are maybe 6, 7, 8 different types you can get. There aren't just 2 rabbit fur colors. There are many alleles that can be combined, and then you've got resulting in one final fur color or whatever. Polygenic inheritance or many gene inheritance means not just more than one allele, more than one gene, more than one section of DNA determines the trait. To review, what is a gene? As we saw back on this picture, it's a segment of that double helix structure, that DNA. We find it in chromosomes, and they carry the information responsible for creating traits because of protein production. An allele is a form of a gene according to our book. It often comes in pairs. That's how we learn about them first. They can also come in a series, right? Multiple alleles. Are there phenotypes that do have just pairs of alleles? Just two options, the dominant or the recessive phenotype. Yes, could be a dimpled chin. Could be whether your earlobe at the bottom is attached or separate. There's really only two options. Some phenotypes will be found in more than two options because of the genotypes having multiple alleles that can determine it. You could have roughly 4 or 5 different blood types. You could have 4, 5, 6, 7 different hair colors. And then, some more intense than others, but really 4 or 5 basic kinds, right? But then there's some that are way more than just 2 or even 5 or 6. Like height, like skin, you can expect a myriad of different options. Really everything from A to B. You can only be so short. But the shortest person I've ever seen is on page 136. You could really only be so tall nowadays, like the guy next to him. But man, there's everything in between, right? There's no height you can't be between those two. This is because it's polygenic. It's not just multiple alleles, but you have more than one gene determining height in humans. So that creates even more options. Got it? The first lesson question for human inheritance is, what are some patterns of human inheritance? The first section is called single gene with 2 alleles. That was the dimpled chin. That was the connected earlobe. Then there's single gene, but multiple alleles in that gene. That would be blood type. Let's talk about that one now. This chart, kind of like the chart they have you looking at on the bottom of page 135, you might label column blood type as phenotype. Your book doesn't do that. And you might add a little label above where it says combination of alleles. That column is genotype, right? The allele makeup is what's going on in the genetic structure, the genotype. And they use the capital letter I, maybe because of inheritance, I don't know. But they don't just use A and B for the genotypes. We use that for what the type is actually going to be called. But the genotype for type A is capital I with an exponent looking A, and then another capital I, A, because those are the alleles for type A. You could also be type A masking the recessive I. Let's jump down to recessive I. That carries the O phenotype. You would need both of those because they are recessive and will be masked by A or B in order to be type O blood type. Are you type O? You can be O negative or you can be O positive. One's very common, one very uncommon. Now, type B is capital IB, or masking the lowercase I. Now, if you end up with both, maybe a parent is type A, the other parent's type B, together you end up inheriting type A and B. These are a co-dominant type of allele, so you'll get both at the same time. All right, your blood type is specifically AB. It's not one or the other. Nothing's being masked. They are both dominant, like when we had the Snapdragon example. Or is it more like the chicken example? Co-dominant? Let's check. Chicken. We had the black and the white feathers. It's really more like that. So lowercase I is recessive, but you might be surprised if you were to actually look at what's the blood type distribution. O positive is about 37% of all people. It's the most common. Followed closely by A positive, which I think is what I am. A little ways after, you have B positive and AB positive. Then the negatives are less likely. Okay? AB negative is actually maybe the least common, according to our pie graph. And that might just be because even though it's recessive, that lowercase I is a little more prevalent. They're more common to have. Now, what is an example of a trait controlled by a single gene with either the dominant or recessive allele? Comprehension check. Remember, that was dimpled chin, attached ear, or the book says widow's peak. That's your hairline if it comes down in a V or a triangle shape, or if it's a straight line on your forehead. How about how many genes control the inheritance of blood type? Just one. Trick question. But page 135, single gene, multiple allele. We learned 3 different types of alleles, right? Last one. This is at the bottom of 136. You're filling out your workbook for next class. One of the questions asks, if Aaron has blood type O, can either of his parents have the type AB? Think about what is the genotype for AB. You can't have a recessive I because AB is a codominant A and B. With no room for a lowercase I, there would be no O alleles to pass on. So Aaron could not have parents with type AB. You could actually know that if you're able to know his blood type's O. Which is the third type of inheritance I haven't touched on as much yet? When you have many genes, or polygenic inheritance, for example, height and skin color. We kind of danced past that earlier. Human height alone has at least 4 different genes controlling it, and so it's no surprise why there are so many heights out there. Now, the second lesson question, what are the functions of what's called the sex chromosomes? Oftentimes we think of that as the 23rd pair. Okay, here's an example of an X and a Y. The X is the bigger chromosome, and the Y is much smaller. It's very distinct. It almost looks like a half a chromosome, right? Right, these are called the sex chromosomes. They're very unique. And as a result, they carry unique traits. They carry the genes that determine gender, aptly named the sex chromosomes. Your sex, male or female, is determined by this 23rd pair. But that's not the only trait they carry. All right? This chromosome may also determine whether you have the disorder hemophilia, it's a blood disorder, or color blindness, a disorder of vision. Do you know if this person, the person whose cell we're blowing up, would be male or female? We have an X and a Y. X and Y means they are male. Males are XY. Females are XX. More on that on page 137. Don't forget to fill in the Punnett square. Now, because of there being that smaller Y chromosome on the male, there's no, and Y chromosomes, as you can see in figure 4, page 138, they don't carry a lot of traits on the Y. The X carries many traits. Since the Y is the Y, it can't cover anything on the X. The X is not being covered by the Y. When you're a boy, you have that Y. So that means that any chromosomes that carry maybe a disorder on an X chromosome in a male are going to be more common. Why? Well, the book explains you won't have anything on this chromosome to possibly change what's going on here. So if there's a male who's got color blindness carried onto this X chromosome, the sex chromosome, there will be nothing over here to possibly override that recessive disorder. Whereas in a female who would have this and an X, maybe they have a dominant for normal vision, would cover that up. So females have a lesser likelihood, almost twice as many colorblind males than females. You have a 1 out of 20 chance of being colorblind, according to probability of inheritance, if you're a girl. Only 1 out of 12 if you're a boy. And if you've ever wondered if you are, maybe you already know you are, and I don't want to scare you, you fill this out at the bottom of 138. You can also look at my pictures here. If you can determine what numbers are hidden in the colored dots, then you are definitely not colorblind. If you're having a hard time making out 7, 13, 16, and then the bottom row says 8, 12, 9, if you're not getting that, then you may be colorblind. Now, a carrier, last term, page 139, would be a person who has one recessive allele for a trait that is therefore not showing if it's covered by a dominant allele, but they're carrying it. They're not expressing, we're not seeing it in the phenotype. It's not in the phenotype, but it's in their genotype, so they're carrying it, and the offspring, if they have one, could unknowingly end up with it if they end up with two recessive, right? If you put two carriers together. All right, make sure you get the Google quiz done and fill out your workbook. Thank you for watching.